Yeah, Casey, I think it is. One participant at a time can share, so I think it's fine. Welcome, everyone. We're going to be getting a whole bunch more here in just a second. So if everybody will be a little patient, because we had about 187 registered for this one today, so we're pretty excited. It's going to take just a little bit to get everybody in.
Okay, thank you. That'd be great.
Okay.
Bunch. Right. Well, we'll have a few more filtering in, but I guess we ought to go ahead and get started and respect everyone's time. If everyone on the call would please mute your mic, I would greatly appreciate it. There's going to be a bunch of us on, and it's very distracting when we have multiple noises coming. Anyway, so my name is Monty Gola, and I'm the executive director for the National Grazing Lands Coalition. And we are super excited to have Mitch Hagney here with Grassroots Carbon, and he's going to be talking to you guys a little bit about kind of the carbon markets, what they can do to help producers, and some of the tools that they use. So Mitch, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Howard, is it okay with you if I plug this into the car? So
well, if everybody could please mute.
For ranchers, but
Okay.
never know about how.
Okay, found it.
Well, thanks.
Go ahead, Mitch.
Well, folks, I really appreciate you having me. I think we have a lot of common interests with most of the grazers around the country, and the carbon market has a lot of different opportunities. I'm going to go through kind of a pretty detailed presentation about the market more generally, and then a little bit of information about our company and what different companies look like in the industry. But we'll have some time for some Q&As as well. And looking forward to hearing from folks. So let me hop into this screen share here. All right. Are we good there? Can we see it?
We can.
All right. Well, we'll get started with the basics, and then we'll dive into the more complex stuff. So some of what I'm going to be talking about today is what a carbon market is in general, how it might be able to affect you and your land, and then also at the end a little bit of the company that I'm representing here as well. So first things first, we'll start with some of the very basics. The greenhouse gases that are emitted from all sorts of industrial and human activity are, we think, increasing the amount of heat retention that's happening in the atmosphere. There's a lot of natural sources for those emissions as well, but we also know that the combustion of fossil fuels in particular, and the emission of CO2 is pretty important, along with a lot of other gases that are going into the atmosphere. So increasingly, it seems like folks are interested in doing something about this. For us, soil is a pretty tremendous opportunity. Soil has more carbon stored in it than all of the plants and all of the atmosphere on the planet combined. And you can see that soil on pastures and grazing lands specifically are a pretty large portion of what that total soil is. So we view that as a substantial opportunity. Now, as companies are getting a lot of pressure for the emissions that they're contributing to, it's coming from a lot of different sources. We know that there are certain consumers that care a lot about what their carbon footprint is. But things that we talk about a little bit less is the way that activist investors have started to influence corporate policy, how hiring practices and whether or not certain employees want to be associated with more environmentally friendly companies or less environmentally friendly. There's a lot of different sources of pressure that are pushing a lot of these large companies in a direction where they're trying to be more cognizant about where their emissions are going. Additionally, there's some pressure that's coming from governments as well, and we'll get into some of that pretty soon. Now, soil as a large carbon sink can be adjusted by land management practices. It can be adjusted by a lot of different things. And so for grazing companies and grazing organizations, it's a pretty big opportunity to potentially be able to store carbon in soil at the same time generating additional health for that soil, biodiversity, water conservation and retention in that soil, and at the same time get paid for that. For a long time, there have been a lot of different land stewards who know that as they adjust their land management practices, they can improve the health of their land. But there haven't in the past been very many ways to finance those improvements. And so carbon storage and carbon credits seem like a good opportunity to be able to help push us in that direction. So at a basic level, there's a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is the primary thing that plants are consuming. And when they do photosynthesis, they end up producing sugars. Those sugars are a lot of the time used directly by those plants in the course of their life cycle, but they also are putting it into their root mass that then is deposited into soil carbon. A lot of this is in the form of something called soil exudates. About 40% of the carbon that plants are producing through photosynthesis is actually emitted outside of the root system into the biome directly around them. And we think that's because plants are trying to proactively improve the microbial environment around them so that there's more active soil health that they can then take advantage of with nutrient uptake and different things like that. But as a result of that deposit, it's a big opportunity for us because grasses can store that carbon outside of their own biomass. And as they die, that carbon continues to accumulate over time, which then can be used by more grasses and more soil microbes, and the cycle continues. So your company makes a pretty big difference, or your property can make a pretty big difference over time, being part of that overall solution for how companies are trying to figure out how to offset their emissions. Certain emissions they can reduce, they can transition towards certain renewable energies, for example, they can increase their efficiency of their manufacturing facilities, but there's certain stuff that companies aren't going to be able to entirely eliminate in terms of their emissions, and that's where we come in terms of offsetting to try to get them closer to their net zero goals. And in the process, generate revenue through carbon credits for land stewards like yourselves. So when we talk about a carbon credit, we group it into one thing a lot of the time, but what it generally means is two things at once. The first thing is that you're capturing the CO2 from the atmosphere itself and you put it into the soil. But the second thing that's being purchased when a company buys a carbon credit is that there's a pledge for that CO2 to be stored. If you capture it, put it in the soil, and immediately till that soil up and release it, then you're not really doing the service that the company is requiring. And so when we think about the service that a carbon credit has, there is the generation of that carbon storage, and then there's the protection, or what we call in the industry, the permanence of that carbon credit. And there's a lot of different ways that people can calculate how long that needs to be. And I'll dive into a little bit of those differences later in the presentation as well. So something else that's important to note is that not every country has the same policy when it comes to carbon credits or carbon emissions. In the United States, we have what's called a voluntary market. So there's no federal mandate in order for net carbon neutrality to happen. So instead, these companies are voluntarily choosing to reduce their emissions through carbon storage, but that also means that there's not a lot of centralized regulatory requirements in what it looks like. In other parts of the world, Europe especially, there's cap and trade programs, and there's even carbon taxes, which means that there's penalties if a company is emitting too much, and there's strategies for them to get closer to that neutrality goal. In the future, a lot of companies, especially large publicly traded companies that are really prone to think about risks, they think that there may be a regulatory market in the United States that's coming down the pipeline, which is another motivation for them to try to set up their infrastructure to offset their carbon now. That could be a carbon tax, it could be a cap and trade. So the voluntary market in the United States, many of these companies think is the precondition to get closer to what they expect is going to be a more regulatory mandated market. And when you're thinking about offsetting your carbon, there's a lot of different ways to do it if you're a big company. You can just lower your emissions, like I mentioned before, but there's also a couple different ways that you can try to store carbon with third-party providers. Now, one of those ways is technology-based solutions. A lot of the time we're calling those direct air capture. That's when you build large machines, oftentimes pretty inefficient and use a lot of energy, very expensive programs, in order to try to compress that CO2 with advanced technology. And then the alternative is what we call nature-based solutions. The most well-known that folks are familiar with is forestry credits, when people are planting large amounts of trees, sucking up the atmosphere, producing tree biomass, and holding it in forests. Less known and big opportunities for us in the grazing space is soil carbon. So large amounts of emissions are happening in the United States in particular, but globally as well, that are eventually going to need to be offset if companies are going to meet their goals. So far in the United States, about 6.6 billion tons of CO2 has been pledged to get towards carbon neutrality at some point in the next couple decades. Globally, that number is much larger. It's past 50 billion tons. And so the question that at least we're trying to answer is it possible to move away from large engineering solutions and towards these nature-based solutions to finance large-scale land improvement that does a lot more than just store carbon, but improves a lot of other environmental services at the same time? For example, Shell has agreed that they want to store 25 million metric tons of CO2 through carbon capture and storage technology by 2035. And they say at the same time they want to store 120 million metric tons of CO2 by 2030 using nature-based solutions. For us, a company like Shell is a pretty good opportunity to be able to sell those credits to, and also be able to finance large-scale land improvements for grazing partners like yourselves. So, okay, that's how demand ends up working. How does supply work, and how does the generation of these storage credits work for organizations like you guys? So ultimately, land management practices are really important. Everyone knows this who's interacted with grazing or large-scale pasture space. How you end up integrating livestock into your property makes a big difference in terms of the overall health of the vegetation and the soil and the microbes that are on site to do that. So 90% of the soil function is delivered by microbes, and a lot of that is dependent on how we're managing that space. And so companies like us are trying to incentivize some land management improvements overall that can also improve soil and land health at the same time. Now, there's a lot of different ways that can end up looking. We make sure when we're working, we work with ranchers all across the country, even some in Canada and Mexico, and not every environment is going to be the same. Not every land practice movements are going to be the same as well. So a lot of studies that our company considers to be credible suggest that rotational grazing is an important way to increase total soil health and as a result, soil carbon. And especially if you can increase the total amount of rest periods and try to adapt to your environment. Adaptive managed grazing practices are one strategy to do that. For very large ranches, we think that rotational is good, but different ranches are going to have really different requirements. How much precipitation are you getting? What's your soil type? What type of livestock are you utilizing? For us, these are important questions that end up getting answered by individual ranches. But we know that conventional style grazing a lot of the time can reduce in carbon loss and a reduction in total soil health. We know that more active managed strategies can increase that carbon and soil health over time. And there's a lot of studies that we believe that are credible that bear that distinction out. So what is the price of a carbon credit? It changes over time. It's quickly becoming a commodity that is traded and thought about in a similar context to other commodities. But what we're pretty sure about so far is that the price of a stored ton of carbon is increasing quickly. In 21, that price tripled in Europe. This is a little graph as well of how the European price has been over the last year or so. And what we've seen in the United States is the same thing, that as demand increases, it's more of these companies are deciding that they want to get closer to carbon neutrality, that there is an increased price at the same time because it's a supply and demand problem. So it'll take a long time for the United States to get parity with the European market if it ever happens. But at the very least, we see the United States market is getting more and more expensive over time, which is more of an opportunity for land stewards as they progress. Now, not every carbon credit is the same as well. So what we're looking at and the way that we end up selling our carbon storage and our carbon credits is that soil-based carbon storage is more valuable than several other types. And as a result, a lot of our partner companies that are buying our carbon credits are willing to spend a higher amount. They think that there are ancillary benefits like biodiversity, like water conservation, like improving long-term food security for the country and the land because of increased soil health and grass potential. So there's a lot of follow-on effects that happen as a result of being able to invest in a soil carbon credit as opposed to just a direct air capture, because we're not just affecting the atmosphere, we're affecting a landscape on a pretty large scale. So the pricing that we end up using competes with all these other strategies for reducing those emissions. And as a result, it gets priced a little bit differently over time. So far, soil carbon seems to be the more expensive carbon credit, and companies that are interested in the more premium version of that product are willing to invest in. So, all right, we figured out the basic market for it. How does it look for you as a land steward and a landowner? A lot of people are calling the carbon market the Wild West. Doesn't really offend us living in the Western United States. We do see a lack of centralized regulation, but as a result, it means that there's a lot of folks in the industry that are over-promising. They're not necessarily transparent. They can be a little bit deceptive in terms of what the price is, what the deals, what the carbon storage potential is. And so for us, at least, we think it's kind of important to get closer to a verifiable, more transparent version of that industry. Most land stewards, we think, are going to be benefited from that increase in transparency. So just so folks know, when we're looking at what a carbon credit is, it's counted differently by different organizations. In Europe, they utilize primarily a standard that's called Verra. Verra has pretty specific requirements for permanence, which is how long that term is for storage, and then as well additionality, which I'll talk about in a minute. But there's a lot of different standards that different broker companies like us can utilize to qualify what is a carbon credit, how much verification is necessary in order to determine that it's been stored over time. Can we just use satellites to be able to guess at how much carbon storage is taking place? Or do we have to do things like go on the ground to measure the total amount that's being stored? If you're looking at forestry credits, is it the size of the tree trunk? Is it the size of the canopy? Is it using remote sensing images from satellites? There's a lot of different ways that standards can decide what a carbon credit is. And as a result, carbon credits produced using those different standards also end up having different prices because they have different levels of credibility. There's a lot of different companies and brokers like ourselves that are trying to utilize these standards, partner with nature-based solutions to try to make it happen. So as you're thinking through the industry in general, you want to do research to figure out which company is using which standard, what does their contract end up looking like for a land steward, because there's huge variations among the different companies because there's no central regulatory body to tell us exactly how those carbon credits need to be counted, need to be verified, need to be sold, things like that. So there's a lot of different companies to investigate in the course of finding out what the better bet for you as a land steward is going to be to try to get access to some of the potential revenue that's in the market. So a lot of landowners are reasonably skeptical of a relatively new market that has contractual obligations for land management. As well, most of these companies haven't been around as long as the contracts are for the term that people are signing up for. So there's a lot of reasonable questions that folks have to try to figure out, is this reasonable for you to be able to leverage as an opportunity for your landowner? We see a lot of people kind of rolling around the industry who strike us a little bit like used car salesmen, where every piece of land can generate 1,000 tons of carbon a year, and that as long as you pay them the bulk of what the price is from the buyer, then it's going to be all good. For us, we try to be a little bit more realistic about those things, but there's a lot of very good questions to be asked through the process of finding out what you're signing up for and exactly how you're going to be affected in the long term. So some folks think, okay, this is a new market. I might as well wait a little bit in order to find out if there's going to be a resilient enough opportunity for me to take advantage of in the long term. For that, we're watching, billions of dollars go to forestry solutions, to engineered direct air capture solutions. And at least my goal is, while that huge market exists, I would rather try to get it towards ranchers and land stewards that are going to be able to do real good on the land with it. So as we wait more and more years, contracts are being signed for alternatives for grazing-based soil carbon storage. One reason to potentially not wait is to try to take advantage of some of that money that's already moving around, that's going to potentially less beneficial locations. So a lot of different things are important for landowners through the process. It's a complicated cycle of all the different organizations, but I'm going to try to simplify it a little bit here. Ultimately, there's buyers of carbon credits, and there's ranchers themselves that are producing those credits. In between, there's about 4 other organizations. One is an assembler or a broker, like Grassroots Carbon. There's a lot of other ones out there. We contract with a measurement company. For us, that's soil-based measurements that actually require core samples to be verifiable amounts of carbon stored. But for other organizations, that will be partnering with satellite images in order to try satellite companies to be able to find out information through remote sensing. Once those measurements take place and we have data on the total amount of soil carbon storage that's happened, then there's verification organizations to receive applications and decide on a mutual projection on how much carbon is being stored over time. Once they agree, they submit their report to a certification entity. That entity takes those applications, processes them, and turns them into carbon credits that can then be sold. And the verification and the certification organization leverage the carbon standard that I talked about earlier to try to figure out exactly whether or not it's compliant with the overall standard that other people are using when they match with that standard. So a lot of different organizations, but at a basic level, there's ranchers, there's buyers, there's several folks in the middle that are verifying the claims of if carbon is being stored and then turning them into credits that can be sold. So very important, and this is true for all long-term arrangements that are happening on private properties, are contracts are the most important thing. The fine print is going to be critical. And also you should leverage a lawyer to be able to check whether or not what's being negotiated is fair to you. Never rely on verbal representations from a company like a carbon broker like us or anyone else, because those things aren't going to be as important as the fine print in the contract. And there's a lot of different questions that pop up. These are just a couple that we deal with a lot in terms of how land owners and land stewards are going to be affected in the long term. I'll get into a couple of them and we'll be able to answer some questions at the end of this as well. So freedom of what exactly you're allowed to do on your property is important. I mentioned permanence a little bit earlier, which is how long the term for carbon storage is. The other important thing to keep in mind is additionality. Additionality, the way that Kyoto defines it, and this is also the way that the Vera protocol that Europe uses defines it, is in order for a carbon credit to take place and be credible, a landowner has to do something very different on their land before and after the carbon credit takes place. For example, if you have a field, additionality could be that you plant a forest on top. It's pretty clear the before and after. For us, that's not a great standard because there's a lot of folks that are actively improving land, actively storing carbon over time that have been doing it for a while. And so additionality is one thing that distinguishes certain standards. We like to work with ranchers that have already utilized rotational or regenerative or even AMP grazing practices. We want to make sure that they still have access to a marketplace where they are performing the service that the buyers are looking for, that they are already storing carbon. We'd like to pay them to be able to continue to store more over time. If you use a Vera protocol in the European market, that's not necessarily something that's doable. So when you're thinking about what contract you're willing to sign up for, what additionality requirements exist is very important to consider. The price is important, and not just the price year one, but also what's going to happen as the price changes over time, because like other commodities, it's going to shift. Certain companies have a fixed price where you sign up for one price this year, and then that price is going to follow through for the course of the entire contract. And also, how are you breaking up who gets how much value? For us, we think fixed prices are probably not the best thing for a land steward. As prices improve over time, we want to make sure that folks get access to a better one. Also, we try to get the vast majority of the profit from the carbon credit sale to the land steward, and I'll get into that a little bit more as well. One other thing to note is that a ton of carbon is different than an acre of carbon storage, and so generally folks should be thinking about how much is the value of a ton, not how much is the value of your acre. Something else that distinguishes a lot of different carbon storage schemes is exactly how are these things verified. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but for us, we measure a meter deep and multiple locations on each ranch. As a result, our measurement cost is a bit higher, but we can sell our credits at a higher price because it's very credible exactly how much carbon storage is taking place. So the way that we do it is we get a baseline measurement, and then we have a verification measurement as well. So keep in mind exactly what your risks are over time, whether or not you have the capacity to switch between brokers, to switch to a better deal, and make sure that you're choosing the right term for a deal that works for you. If you're planning on selling your land, or if you're planning on potentially tilling or developing, then those are important things for you to consider as well. So now, this is an example company. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased, but there's a lot of other offerings that are out there. I'm just going to describe how our company works as an example. So we try to make it pretty easy for ranchers to get paid for their carbon storage. And we try to be pretty transparent about how it works, what it pays, what folks have to do, and what the risks are. So I already mentioned the general structure for how most of these work. We are the assembler or the broker within this arrangement. And we've already set up a lot of who our measurement companies are, our verification companies or certification entities. And we've been operating, even though we're fairly young, we've been operating longer than most of the rest of the carbon brokers and assemblers in the market. So we leverage two different models that are available for landowners. One is using a standard called the regen standard, the regenerative standard. Those are 15-year agreements. That's the permanence. Folks get paid for the first 5 years. There's a storage term that takes place for 10 years afterwards. And then there's a buffer that gets distributed at the end as well that I'll explain in a second. An alternative is a 30-year arrangement that uses VERA standards. And those are also saleable in Europe as opposed to just saleable in a voluntary market in the United States. So you get options when you work with a company like us to figure out which standard and which version of a contract you're interested in. For us, we make sure that because of our measurement strategies, they're guaranteed atmospheric greenhouse gas reductions, because we are going on the ground in order to measure deep samples on each site to get the total soil organic carbon emissions, which means that we're not estimating the numbers that are taking place and guessing based on vegetation data. We're going on the ground and figuring out exactly how much carbon is getting stored over time. It means that we get to sell at a bit of a higher price. Also means that we don't have the same additionality requirements because we can prove carbon has been stored. It means you don't have to project out based on a land use change. At no point do we end up taking control of your land. There's no way for us to end up getting access to controlling it. The landowner and the land steward still figure out how they want to manage that. And there's some flexibility for how different ranchers are utilizing the standard over time. And for 10 years, we think that's a reasonable permanence amount where folks can still plan around it, but it doesn't lock them into an indefinite future. This is just a little example. So presume that you start with 60 tons of CO2 per acre when we take our baseline measurement, which is year 1. In year 5, it turns out that each acre had about 15 tons more as a result of practice improvements and overall carbon storage strategies. That's great. That means that as a result, there's quite a bit of tons of CO2 that can be monetized as carbon credits and sold. So to make sure that you're not waiting 5 years to be able to get payments, the verification organizations that we work with do pre-assessed credits that are conservative to allow us to distribute payments every year. So when we're guessing, okay, you're going to store 1 ton of carbon per year, then we can distribute payments for 1 ton of carbon. When we measure up 5 years later, then we can square up the payments that we've already distributed with what's actually measured. As a result, there's a real incentive to continue practice improvements over time. So you're still getting annual payments, but then at year 5, if it's proven that they have stored a lot more carbon than that, that's great. And everyone gets paid quite a bit. This is just an example of how those carbon soil samples are taken. We end up doing a process that we call stratification, which varies based on your topography, your soil type, and a couple other variables to figure out how many samples take place. The location of those samples taken are secret to us, they're secret to you, so that's not easy to game the system. And so then 5 years later, when the sampling company comes back, they know where those are and they can take the samples to figure out an accurate reading. There's a buffer that I mentioned briefly, which is in order to maintain the incentive to keep carbon storage over time, 10% of the credits are held in escrow. They don't go to us. They are held by that third-party certification organization. Those credits are distributed to be sold at the end of the storage term. So because they're 10-year storage commitments, that means you start getting that buffer back in year 11, and then you get the last piece of that buffer back in year 15. Now, one other thing to note is that 15 years is not the only term of the contract that's possible. If folks are interested in renewing for another 5-year sales term, that's great. It just expands it to a total 20-year commitment, and that can continue as well. So the risks are important for us to be able to keep in mind. Fundamentally, the gamble that's being taken on the total measurement cost, which is not cheap, ends up being a gamble that we, Grassroots Carbon, are taking. We front the money to be able to do that soil measurement, and there's no out-of-pocket cost for a rancher to be able to start this process. We end up paying 80% of the profits from the carbon sales, which is a pretty good deal as you look in the market in general. We haven't found any company that's offering more than 80% of the sale of that carbon. Something else that's important is that for us, you retain the freedom of how you want to interact with that land. There's incentives to continue to store more carbon. There's a lot of resources that we offer through the course of joining our program. We give access to scholarships to programs like Understanding Ag, Ranching for Profit. We have bulk discounts for things like electric fencing, cover crop seed, different things like that. There is an active webinar community to try to increase the total amount of carbon stored over time. And we also give access to Pasture Map, which I'll get into in a second, for free for folks that enter our Land Steward Alliance, which is the ranches that are actively storing carbon through our program. So we have incentives to continue to store more carbon. And ultimately, the best incentive is going to be at that year 5 measurement, how much carbon is accrued. That's how much money ends up going into your pocket. So these are just a couple examples. This is a 5,000 acre ranch looking at a couple different possibilities. We don't have to dive into the granular detail here, but how much is estimated affects how much folks are getting paid on an annual basis, and then how much is measured at the end ends up affecting what the total payout ends up being. But it can range anywhere from $350,000 over 5 years to well over $1 million, depending on how much carbon is actually stored on that property. One other thing, at least for us to brag about, is we were the first company to distribute payments to ranchers for soil carbon storage. That happened at the beginning of this year. We paid between $200,000 and $300,000 towards the beginning of the year. By the end of the year, we're slated to have distributed more than $1 million in payments directly to ranchers. And like I said, we're the first company to be able to do that. So these are what the steps end up looking like. If you're interested in getting involved, you end up contacting us. You review the agreement itself to make sure that everything makes sense to you. We end up scheduling and getting done the initial soil carbon measurements. You keep your soil healthy, and we sell those carbon credits. We keep 20%, you keep 80%, and everybody goes home with a little bit more money. So Pasture Map is one other thing I wanted to mention real briefly. This is a type of software that we've used that about 25,000 ranchers or so have already utilized. It allows folks to log where their herd movements are in between pastures and paddocks. It also allows you to track a lot more data than that. You can project out when those herd movements take place. We have a new to-do list to interact with ranch hands. So if you want to give tasks to employees of yours, then it'll pop up automatically with a geolocation for where those tasks need to be. You can put in infrastructure like fencing, gates, water lines, things like that. So if you want to log where something is broken or where something needs to be dealt with, then that's easy too. And then you can also add photos of different things that are happening on your pastures through that platform as well. And so we actually have a discount code going with the National Grazing Lands for 50% off if you sign up with a coupon through that. So just keep in mind some of the risks for a lot of different carbon contracts that are available. For us, there's no possible out-of-pocket costs. If we make a bad bet and you don't store enough carbon, then that's a bet that we've made. You don't have to give back the payments. You keep the money that's already been distributed. If you end up losing carbon, not because of things like drought or things beyond your control, but you end up tilling or developing a large portion of that soil, then there is a contractual penalty. So that's something to keep in mind. Make sure not to sign a contract if you're considering doing things that are going to do really large scale soil disturbance in the long term. But if there are factors beyond our control, that's a risk that we take as a carbon broker, and that's part of the basic value proposition that we're offering. So I think we figured out most of those risks. This is Loy Sneary. He's one of our first ranchers. These are just a couple quotes from him on why he picked Grassroots Carbon and what the advantage looks like for him. This is exactly the model that he's looking for, and that the payments that he's already received help offset costs for certain land management decisions that he's made as well to go towards adaptive high stock density. Now, again, not every rancher is going to use high stock density type strategies. This is one rancher. This is what ended up working for him. So if you're interested in working with us, I would recommend that you reach out through our website. We have form submissions where you can give us a little context about your location. We'll get you back with kind of a preliminary estimate. But in general, our company, like I said, is just one of many. So you should look at the carbon market more generally. What are standards? What are potential buyers' prices look like? What are potential other brokers? And compare us, because once you sign a contract, then you're probably going to be working with a company for a pretty long period of time. So I didn't want to take too much time, but I was hoping to give a little bit of context, and I'm happy to answer any questions as well.
Good deal, Mitch. Thank you very much. Yeah, we've actually had several in the chat. Would it be best if I just go ahead and read some of these out loud, or?
Yeah, why don't we go through them one by one? I didn't have a chance to look while I was presenting.
Okay, so Brian Alexander asked, will landowners be able to access their carbon storage data to inform what management practices have been working to store more carbon?
Yeah, Brian's question is a really important one. The answer is yes. So when we distribute when we get information back from the soil testing labs, some work faster than others. Some of the new folks that we've been working with have started to work quite a bit quicker than previous folks that we've dealt with. Landowners do get access to be able to see that soil data. And for those folks, oftentimes it can be really important to figure out which of their land management decisions are affecting carbon. We want folks to have that feedback over time, because we want them to be able to adjust those practices to do more carbon storage throughout the process.
Good deal. So Corey Farnsworth asks, who owns the carbon? For example, a rancher with thousands of acres of grazing lands that is owned by the BLM or U.S. Forest Service or the federal agency.
So federal land is a little bit challenging, but let me answer the basic premise first. The landowner, if it's different than the person who's utilizing the land for their grazing practices, will agree to the carbon contract at the same time that the land steward does. So a deal is usually struck between the landowner and the land steward on how they want to break out that 80% that's being generated. There's a lot of different models. We don't really have strong recommendations for exactly what that relationship is going to end up looking like. But the land steward is able to generate the value, but it needs to be approved by the landowners as well. So usually the landowner will only sign that once there's been some discussion that takes place about how the value is split. For Corey's specific question about how BLM land ends up working, at the moment, there are examples of public land that's leveraged for soil carbon that's municipal or county. So far, federal lands have not been utilized for soil carbon storage. However, for the first time ever, the BLM agreed in September to do some direct air capture carbon storage on their land. Now, that's not nature-based soil carbon storage, but it signals a willingness that BLM and other federal land is likely to soon enable folks to enter that marketplace. What that ends up looking like in detail, totally unpredictable because there's not a test case yet, but federal lands are probably going to end up being accessible because the work that's being done is by the person who's doing the grazing, not the federal agency that owns them. So we'll see what it ends up looking like, but recently in September, they indicated a willingness to utilize that land in a carbon storage marketplace.
So Chris asks, how does carbon credits address the issues of loss of viable land through subdivisions and urban sprawl? Will this help offset the money that could be generated through subdivisions?
So we want to stay realistic about the total amount of revenue that's generatable through these processes. A lot of large-scale commercial development is going to be able to generate long-term more profit for a property owner than carbon credits alone. However, some of the revenue that's produced through carbon credits does have the ability to have alternate land uses. So if a property owner is looking at their mortgage, trying to figure out, all right, well, I need X amount of money in order to prevent large-scale development that's going to take place. That's my primary alternative. What we're seeing at least is that, yes, there are landowners that are able to leverage carbon credits as an alternative to other land uses. One other thing to just note here is carbon credits are one environmental service that's being evaluated, but in the future, there are likely to be a lot of other ones as well. I've talked to carbon credit buyers that are interested in commoditizing water conservation credits, biodiversity credits, averted development credits, which is especially interesting to folks that are working on conservation easements. There are potentially going to be credits about specific bird conservation or microbe or pollinator. So agreeing for carbon storage doesn't preclude any ability to leverage those future marketplaces that are coming down the pipeline. But there's a lot of money in urban sprawl. What I'm definitely not saying is there's enough in soil carbon storage to halt those because there's so much more value being produced. You'll just end up having to look at the individual numbers in between each of those things. But extra revenue isn't going to hurt your ability to resist those development pressures is kind of where we're coming from.
Good deal. I think this next one's really more of a comment from Kurt Reinhardt, but I'll read it anyway. If you want to respond, that'd be great. Measuring soil carbon is difficult and expensive. If new management is applied and the soil ends up with less, not more carbon in the future, and that's kind of where he ends it. So I think you might have addressed some of that.
Yeah, this is the risk that we end up taking as a company is the measurement costs are taken by they're initially fronted by our company. Payments for those carbon credits come out before the profit goes out that we end up splitting. But if the total amount of carbon that's stored is not enough to justify the cost of that measurement, that's a gamble that we're taking rather than a gamble that the land steward has to take. So it is possible, and we're hoping to work with enough land stewards that if that happens on several properties, then we're going to be able to generate enough to be able to offset the losses from some of those spots.
Okay. This next one is from Larry Butler. If carbon credits must be additional to the present, then it seems the landowner who has already been storing carbon with intensive grazing systems and or regenerative practices is penalized for his or her excellent management. The poorest beginning management has the most to gain. Please clarify.
So Larry, we agree with you there 100%. In the European model, that's what it looks like. Folks that are already doing things right are not able to generate extra value through the carbon credit market. For us and the standard that we use, it has the notion of additionality is how much additional carbon is stored, not how much additional land use changes are happening. As a result, folks that have already been doing high quality land management over time have access to the carbon credit market through the types of standards that we're using.
Good deal. So Judy DeVore says, have any of your current clients added biochar to their land to increase carbon storage?
Judy's question is a really good one. There are limitations based on the standard for what soil supplements or additional stuff that you can put on is. The addition of biochar, because it's a lot of carbon, has the potential to really affect those numbers substantially. There is no doubt that additional carbon through applications of things like biochar increases soil health over time. There are, however, restrictions on our ability to control how much of that is happening through photosynthesis and how much is happening through the application of biochar. So most of the standards that we end up using don't reward the application of biochar because it skews the numbers too much. There are, we think, carbon credit opportunities out there for biochar applications specifically, but that's not something that our company deals with too much directly, just because it has too much potential to skew the numbers.
Good deal. Sam Newell asks, what if I end up losing carbon in the soil? Example being a fire or drought impacts. Do I pay that back, or how does that work? And I think you did talk about that, but I'll go ahead and let you answer it.
Yeah, the short version is if you're losing carbon through things like a fire or drought, that's a gamble that we're taking. If you lose carbon because you choose to till in year 7, that's an issue with the contract that is going to be a challenge. So if they're natural causes, then that's something that the land steward is never going to have to pay anything out for. If they violate the contract to till and then release that carbon, then there is an issue.
I think Mary Anderson's question's already been asked. It was about, are your services different for public land? I think you touched on that just a little bit ago. Sam Newell asks, is this just based on what I can sequester in the soil or additional practices I implement?
So for our model, it's based off of explicitly what's stored in the soil. So as a result, our year 1 and year 5 measurements end up figuring out how much additional storage is taking place. The practices themselves are a means to get to that additional storage, but land stewards aren't paid for the practice changes themselves. They're through the Vera type model, in the European style model, there is carbon credits that take place from projections based on land uses. For us, we're looking for more verifiable, scientifically grounded improvements in carbon storage, and that's the reason why we choose those soil samples.
Brad File asks, if the U.S. moves from free market to cap and trade in the future, what is the landowner's liability and options to offset their own emissions if they have already sold all available credits from that operation?
So within the contracts that we have, at least with our company, there is an ability to sell credits to a different location as opposed to using a broker like us. What ends up having to happen is that you pay for the lost credits that were agreed upon before. In Brad's example, if a cap and trade market ends up happening, I think it's safe to say we're likely to see that the price of carbon is going to increase substantially. So if that's true, and a land steward or a company would rather leverage their own reduction in emissions, then they would be able to take the difference between those two in order to compensate us for the lost credits. Does that make sense?
Okay. John Talbot asks, I would be interested in hearing more about claiming credits on federal leases. We have approached U.S. It just jumped. Sorry. We approached U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and BLM concerning this question, and we have only heard that they cannot answer that question.
Unfortunately, John, it's not an answer I have as well. I can tell you the same way that if you're leasing land from a private entity, the landowner has to agree to the contract. At the moment, the federal government doesn't have the ability to agree to a long-term soil carbon contract because it's just not a policy of theirs. In the future, I really think that it's going to be based on their signaled willingness to do direct air capture on those properties, but it's not something that we've worked with in the past because there's no company that's been able to convince them yet to do that. The lobbying market for direct air capture at the federal government is substantially larger than the lobbying market for nature-based solutions, and even smaller inside that is whatever lobbying market exists for soil carbon. And so as a result, federal policy hasn't shifted on it much. But my guess is that there's going to be deals that happen in the short term that get us closer to being able to leverage federal land.
And then kind of tacking on to that, Mary Anderson asks, how about state lands?
So state lands, there's, I believe, 2 states, and I'm forgetting exactly which at the moment, that have already approved soil carbon storage on their properties. But it's going to end up being a state-by-state basis, just like most other regulatory or land ownership issues.
And Judy asks, is there a limit on the size of a ranch you will work with in terms of acreage?
So there's no limit. However, there has to be sufficient credits generated to justify the expense of a sampling event. And so it can vary. If you're in a very high carbon storage potential area, then it can be a much smaller acre property. If you're in one that accrues carbon at a lower rate, then it needs to start out at a larger minimum. And I didn't dive into this too much, but generally we find that the most important variables for latent potential for carbon storage end up being precipitation and soil type. Not to say that drier areas that are sandier can't store carbon. They definitely can. They just store carbon less quickly than areas that have more clay soils with more precipitation. So how big those ranches end up being is affected by those basic geologic and geographic variables. And then of course, by the land management practices. But that's how we end up thinking about sizing, is a size right off of the Gulf of Mexico, where they get lots of rain and they have lots of clay. That size ends up being different than if you're in Western Wyoming.
Holly Dyer says, what is the price per ton we're experiencing so far? Who are the purchasers, big emitters only, or others, NGOs?
So it's actually because it's traded as a commodity right now. It's illegal for me to give a price to a large group like this. That's what the SEC considers price setting. Individually, we can talk about what prices end up being, but I can answer the other question, which is who are the purchasers? We see a range of sometimes they're smaller organizations, sometimes they're mission focused, oftentimes they're very large and they're publicly traded. I would say the majority of the market right now are very large, usually publicly traded companies. Examples of buyers that we're already working with are Marathon Oil and some other fossil fuel companies, Shopify and other fintech or technology or software-based companies, large grocery chains, and then some as well that are nonprofits or they're specifically motivated for climate change reduction. So it's a mix, but the bulk of the money I would say is coming from companies that have a particularly high environmental footprint.
And Nathan Clackham, I apologize if I butchered that, asks, as an addition to Larry Butler's previous question, the manager who has done good practices in the past and continues to do so theoretically has built a lot of carbon in their soil. It is harder to go from 1 to 2 tons stored than 0 to 1 ton stored. How does Grassroots compensate for this to keep the higher incentive there for the ongoing good land steward?
So this is a challenging one. It's very difficult to quantify the overall improvements as a result of previous land management versus just latent carbon that's in the soil because of natural geological or geographic phenomena. So for us, the measured increase that's end up paid for is what happens between year 1 and year 5. And that's the amount of credits that are able to be generated. But one reason why we think meter deep core samples are so important is because it takes a while for carbon to be able to get that deep into the soil layer. And so if a land steward has been doing regenerative style grazing management for 30 years, it's our belief that below that topsoil area, there's still going to be net carbon accrual that takes place, especially because the soil microbes over time are able to interact with more carbon as a basic feedstock to be able to generate more biomass. So it's true that once you reach a certain level of carbon storage, it's challenging to continue to increase it. Our belief is that deeper soil profiles help extend that runway to show deeper amount of carbon that's being stored over time. But ultimately what's quantified is what happens between measurement year 1 and measurement year 5. And that's because things that happen prior to that are very difficult to distinguish whether or not they're practice-based or geologic.
We just had a new question pop up from Holly Dyer. Do you think the market to buy credits will remain if federal subsidies decrease or go away entirely?
So federal subsidies are actually not a powerful driver for carbon storage. Because it's a voluntary market entirely, there's no cap and trade market. This is almost entirely driven by voluntary corporate requirements that are taking place. Ultimately, we'd like to see federal involvement, but there's not a subsidy that directly affects the price of carbon storage at the moment.
Okay. Tricia Faring asks, is there a baseline dollar value per acre that we can estimate when working through the decision-making process of a carbon credit contract?
For us, yes, we have a minimum amount that we can pay out per year. For us, again, I'm sorry, because we're speaking to so many people at once, I have to be careful of this specific question, but the answer is yes. There's a minimum that we can end up paying out that you can base your projections on as a low estimate, and then as the price increases, and that number is about 2/3 of what the price is that we've been selling at for the last year. So it would presume somewhat of a crash of that price. But again, I in the context like this, I'm not legally allowed to give it.
Good deal. Well, nothing else has popped up in the chat. Is there any other questions? Oh, wait a minute. Sam Newell asked, do you pool ranches and contracts together and make it a bigger contract?
So Sam, it's a great question. We do that for certain ranches. It's not the majority of our groups. And the advantage is that it lowers the sampling cost because we can deploy our large scale kind of soil sampling crew all at once rather than having to distinguish it into smaller, more expensive batches. And so that it is helpful and it increases the profit for both the land steward and us. Sam's follow-up question is if the verifier pays the sampling cost. I should phrase it as we collectively pay the sampling cost to the verifier. So the 80-20 split happens for profit. So we take out year 1 and year 5, how much we're directly paying to that verifier who's doing the soil sampling. And then what's left, we split 80-20. Now it's notable that only happens year 1 and year 5, which means that year 2, 3, and 4, there's no sampling cost. And so it's a higher payout. But if we can pool different companies, then we're able to, or different land stewards, then we're able to reduce that price. And that happens for us sometimes, although it's not the majority of our contracts.
I think Holly Dyer had one more. Sorry for all the questions, but do most of your producers, land stewards, end up liquidating their livestock herd during the term of their contract?
So Holly, it varies. Most do not. In fact, if you're willing to do more active land management practices, oftentimes you can increase your herd because you are controlling how long they're able to graze on their property. But there are certain ranchers that destock a bit based off of what they see. And oftentimes, if you're going to decrease your herd size by 15%, but you increase your profit because of carbon credits by two times what you were going to make that year, then that trade-off is well worth it because you're making sure to not overgraze. But it just varies based off of what the land management strategy is that rancher is going to take. And again, it's going to be different in a really arid area of the far west, or if you're in the eastern United States doing ranching over there as well.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions. Sam Newell asked, what percentage should I expect to get after the broker, verifier, and other additional expenses needed for me to enroll and stay enrolled?
So again, I'm not legally allowed to give up the price of what the carbon is itself in this context, but the price for the expenses are generally capped at less than half of what's paid out as the carbon credit sale. And so that's contractual as well. So we're not allowed to charge anything past that for what the cost is. And again, those costs don't go to us as a company. They go to the third parties that we're working with that are doing the soil sampling, that are doing the application fees. We have to look at what the individual ranch is, But even on year 1 and year 5, you should be getting more than 50% of the sale of, or the profit should end up being more than 50% of the sale of the carbon credit.
All right, and Alec asks, are you selling direct to purchasers or do the credits move to a registry and sold from there?
So purchasers are generally only interested in carbon credits that are stored on a registry, because that's the only way to prevent what we call double counting, when one credit can be sold to a bunch of different companies. So we move it to a registry, but then we are the ones that do the sale to the purchasers. So the registry functionally stores the carbon credit, and then we're the ones that decide when it goes into that and then when it's distributed out for profit.
Good deal. Well, thank you, Mitch. I really appreciate it. It is 1:01 and we want to respect everyone's time and your time too. So I guess if anybody has any further questions, Mitch, is the information info@buildgrassroots.com. Is that where they should contact you?
Yes, if folks are interested in general and just want to reach out, we have a contact page that folks are welcome to reach out to. If you're a rancher or you're just interested in your property in general for carbon credits, then we have a land stewards page on buildgrassroots.com. We would love to hear from you, and we can start the process for trying to estimate the total amount that you could generate as revenue on your property.
Good deal. Well, thank you again, Mitch. We really appreciate it. Our next Graze On Over is January 12th at 12 noon Central Time, and we are going to try to do something similar, have a guest speaker. Once again, this seems to be a resounding success. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and we will see you in January. Thank you.